I think it's the worst case. I can't think of another case of the weaponization of U.S. government intelligence agencies to engage in electoral interference. No proven case.
Let's talk about Mark Zuckerberg. He's recently written a letter to Congress after Republicans asked him a series of questions about censorship, and it was quite a revealing letter. Can you talk about what he revealed and what this means for the election this year?
Well, this is a very important letter. I think you have to, my interpretation of it is that he was trying to answer and put to bed a set of lingering concerns among Republicans that Facebook is biased towards Democrats. And so he expressed his regret that he and his company had gone along with demands from the Biden administration to censor more COVID information. Recall, we have these internal documents from Facebook showing the Biden administration pressuring Facebook responding to the Biden administration saying increased censorship of vaccine discussions, including accurate information about side effects, we think will increase vaccine hesitancy because people will ask, why are we being censored if the vaccine's totally safe? Why are you censoring conversations about it? The White House said you should censor it anyway. And Facebook did because it was worried about not having the cooperation of the White House in dealing with the Europeans, particularly dealing with the transfer of data back from Europe to the United States, which is a huge concern and issue. So I think me and I think many others would look at that as a case of a violation of the First Amendment. The U.S. government's not supposed to do anything that would limit free speech. It's a bittersweet letter because if that letter had come out before the Supreme Court ruled on this issue, I think the loss that we had in the Supreme Court would have gone the other way. I think the other most significant thing about the letter was that Zuckerberg, reiterated that the FBI had come to Facebook to warn that the Hunter Biden laptop could be disinformation. There's actually a new detail in the Zuckerberg letter, and I'm working on a story about it right now, which is that Zuckerberg said that the FBI had warned of Russian disinformation specifically around the Biden family and Burisma. That was not something that Zuckerberg had admitted recently to Joe Rogan. I think it's the worst case. I can't think of another case of the weaponization of U.S. government intelligence agencies to engage in electoral interference. No proven case. So it's a major scandal, and very few Americans still know about it because the media has been complicit in its anti-Trump bias in perpetuating this really ongoing disinformation. And I've testified multiple times in front of Congress, and you can watch online. I've had arguments with Representative Dan Goldman, who has insisted that somehow, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, another famous member of Congress, has also suggested there's still some idea that maybe the laptop is Russian disinformation. It's so absurd. So it really is. I think it's a very significant moment. This was a huge conspiracy, and that's not a theory. It's a proven conspiracy. And Zuckerberg, offered one more detail to confirm precisely what we had reported a year and a half ago.
What's going on with Mark Zuckerberg? Why is he? It seems like he's sort of changing his tune a little bit. He's saying that he regrets what Facebook did in terms of the censorship over COVID disinformation and on the Hunter Biden laptop story. Why is he suddenly having this reverse, or is this all just? What do you think? What's going on behind this letter?
My interpretation of the letter is that he wanted that he felt that he needed to reaffirm the nonpartisan nature of Facebook. There was a third issue in the letter that he dealt with, which is that he described donations that he made in 2020 that most Republicans believe were donations to help Democrats get out the vote and elect Joe Biden. He in the letter said that they were not partisan. They were just for getting out the vote and election integrity. So I think I read this letter as Zuckerberg going through the three big issues that Republicans have had to view Facebook as interfering in elections. I think everybody knows that there's a 50-50 chance that Trump could be elected president, that there could be, retribution. He wants to be on the right side of it. I also think that he wants to affirm neutrality around politics in order to, maintain a large Republican presence on Facebook, which includes Republican advertising. So I think it was a calculation that they hadn't quite done enough to put to bed the perception of Facebook as putting its finger on the scale for Democrats.
Do you think there's a shift in Silicon Valley towards free speech and away from the Democratic Party that has been so dominant for the last few decades in terms of their grip on social media companies and just more broadly in the tech world?
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. The biggest part of that is just Elon Musk buying Twitter and ending the internal censorship efforts, replacing it with a fact-checking efforts called community notes, where the public can crowdsource and fact-check. But we've seen it in other ways. We saw David Sacks hosting a fundraiser for Donald Trump. David Sacks has one of the most popular business podcasts in the country called All In. They had Trump on. So I think that you've seen, and you also saw Mark Andreessen and Ben Horowitz, who are two of the most famous venture capitalists in Silicon Valley, donate money to Trump. So I do think, we're seeing a much bigger change. And I think brought more broadly by the business community, but certainly by Silicon Valley, led by Elon Musk and his friend David Sacks.
And what do you think the consequence of that will be for the election this time around? Because you're making these accusations about the 2020 election that there was serious interference. Do you think that there's been a shift in 2024 away from this kind of interference or censorship?
I think so. I think that the FBI has been, chastened by this. I think it's been embarrassing for them. We also know that the Stanford shut down the Stanford Internet Observatory, which was one of the main organizations, working on behest of the Department of Homeland Security to engage in a mass censorship effort in 2020, 2021. I've seen no evidence that anything similar is occurring this year, either in the form of disinformation or significant censorship. Now, I hasten to add that Facebook still engages in a lot of ideological censorship that's wrong, including on COVID, on climate change, but it doesn't appear to be something that's being demanded directly or overtly by governments. It appears to be something that's coming from NGOs. Now, some of those NGOs may be getting government funding, so there could be some indirect role there, but certainly we're not seeing anything approaching the catastrophe that occurred in 2020.
Do you think that Elon Musk, he has allowed maybe too much content on Twitter? Some people are complaining about Twitter becoming more full of like hate speech and pro-Nazi stuff or something like that. So do you think that Twitter now has become a kind of cesspit of hatred? Some journalists are making that claim.
Yeah, I personally don't think so. And it's important to remember that journalists were making that claim before Elon Musk had really done anything with the platform. I'm an American. I think that we have the strongest free speech protections in the world and that it's the right model. The assumption is that speech is legal unless proven otherwise. We've created a few exceptions, around child pornography or around immediate incitement to violence. I think the big case here, of course, is the riots that occurred in your country, in Britain. For Americans, we draw the line at immediate incitement to violence. And that's a Supreme Court ruling that was affirmed by the Supreme Court. So for me, I think that what I think should be legal is I think you should be allowed to say really ugly, awful things, including racist things, anti-immigrant things. I think I draw the line when you are immediately inciting that violence. So, for example, if you've used social media or any other form to get a mob outside of an immigrant hotel or migrant, apartment in London, and then all of your supporters are there, and then you post something that says, now burn it down or now kill people or something. I do believe that should be illegal. I think that's immediate incitement to violence. It's at that point that the language becomes part of the action as opposed to being a form of speech. But I mean, you have to remember, in the United States, we allowed Nazis to march on the street through, neighborhoods of Holocaust survivors. It's a very famous 1978 case. But the line is drawn when if those Nazis were to say, burn that house down or kill that person. That's the immediacy of it. I think it's fair to say that many people in the world, including probably many Americans, that immediacy is still too high of a bar, and that it should be lowered to incitement. But I think that the problem is that when you make incitement to violence the standard, it basically almost anything can be considered incitement. If you were to say things like, I think that Britain has too many immigrants, that could be considered incitement to violence by somebody because it's a completely subjective determination.
You talk about the arrests in Britain over social media posts. What's your overall view of Britain and social media and censorship and so on? We saw people being arrested for posting inaccurate information over the recent riots. Some really sort of scary cases. I don't know if you've looked into some of the individual cases, but do you think Britain is no longer a free country?
Well, I'm a newcomer to Britain. I've been spending more time there. I have to say I am surprised by the prosecutions for things that people posted online. I don't think many of them have passed the test of immediacy that I think is important. But I mean, there's definitely some ugly things. I mean, when people say we should go burn down those migrant hotels, I think that's sort of the archetypal case here. I think it's really on the line. It's one thing when the mob is there assembled to say that. It's another thing, somebody's sort of like, somebody should burn them all down or just say something like that. I think it's ugly and reprehensible and should be condemned. I don't know that I think it should require prison. That seems, rather harsh. So again, for me, the issue is incitement. And it's funny because, of course, our two countries have had a very long history, and our First Amendment was really put in place to as a way to not be like Britain. And I think a lot of Americans, I think we all thought that Britain, that there'd been huge changes since the 18th century when America created our Constitution and separated from Britain. But in some ways, I think it hasn't changed. The free speech were rights granted by the king over time in Europe. And in the United States, we started on a fresh piece of paper and said the default position of free speech, and that the government has to justify any infringement upon it. So to some extent, I think these are just national differences. But yeah, I definitely worry about what's called concept creep, which is the widening definition of what constitutes harm. It seems to me to be a recipe for the abuse of power.
This idea of arresting people for posting inaccurate information, that seems quite odd.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I'm against it. I mean, we have in the United States very strong protections for spreading false information. We also have pretty strong protections for lying. In fact, there's a brilliant book written by Jeff Kosef called Liar in a Crowded Theater, where he goes through all of these cases where people are allowed to lie. Some of the most brilliant legal writings have described just how frequently everybody lies. White lies, other lies, politicians lies. I mean, the idea that you're going to have the government go and investigate and prosecute people for lying, it's absurd. It's a recipe for arbitrary enforcement of laws. And remember, arbitrary enforcement is just a huge concern for all liberal democracies. You don't want to define, part of the reason you don't want to criminalize in such broad ways is that it allows for arbitrary prosecution. So some forms of speech would be prosecuted and others wouldn't. It allows for basically a politicization of the judiciary. So yeah, I think that's a really bad, dangerous thing. Again, I just kind of come back to I think the Supreme Court in the United States did a really good job in drawing the line at immediate incitement to violence. I mean, you can immediately incite violence by telling the truth, and I think the response I saw from the British police was, be careful what you post. Well, that's potentially a chilling effect. I mean, you don't want to chill. You don't want people to feel inhibited and afraid of posting legal content, on social media. I mean, I think we'd all do better to not be reactive, but you worry that people are going to basically not engage in important political discussions, including around what may be the most important issue in all of the major Western countries right now, which is, what do we do about this huge influx of migrants, and do we keep accepting them? There has to be a robust debate about that. Otherwise, we can't function as democracies.
Well, this is the question: is the government's response was think before you post, and they warned against posting so-called hate speech or sort of inciting hatred. And I think that many in the UK feel that this is aimed at one group of people, that and the sort of the way that they interpret so-called hatred or inciting hate speech can only go one way. Well, that's the interpretation anyway, and it seems that the law isn't being applied fairly. Yeah, what do you make of this idea of sort of inciting hatred? It's quite a subjective term, isn't it?
Well, right. I mean, do we think that we're going to eliminate hatred from the human condition?
And what is hatred? Like, you could say something that I say is hatred, and you disagree with that.
It's a completely subjective judgment. I mean, I guess you could say that immediate incitement to violence is subjective, but I would say it's a lot less subjective. If you're saying like, go burn that thing down or go kill that person, you're actually urging a specific action. Hatred is just an evaluation of what's in the heart of another person. I think it's very dangerous. I think I saw something where somebody was saying they were going to try to investigate or prosecute whoever wrote some anti-white graffiti recently, but it doesn't make me feel much better. I mean, I saw that and I kind of laughed. I was sort of like, it's very common among woke people in our countries to say anti-white things. I mean, arguably anti-white hatred is the most socially accepted form of hatred in our society. So, be careful what you wish for. It sometimes sounds like rhetoric when we say that, we have to defend free speech for everybody, because if you create a censorship apparatus, it will ultimately be used against you. It sounds like rhetoric, but I think it's definitely true, and we're seeing it in both of our countries.
Does the arrest of the founder of Telegram represent a blow to freedom of speech?
Well, it very well could. It's obviously coming in the context of a global crackdown on free speech that we've been monitoring for the last several years. It comes in the context of the European Union's top censor, Thierry Breton, sending an open letter to Elon Musk warning against his conversation with Donald Trump, which did not sit well with many Americans. We view that as a kind of election interference. And in fact, we saw the good news is we saw Breton be scolded by his colleagues in articles in Financial Times and elsewhere, saying that he had overstepped. We've seen the Brazilian government engage in mass censorship to such an extent that X, formerly Twitter, was forced to close its office there rather than participate in the tyranny. We've seen crackdowns in Scotland, Canada, the UK, and the rest of Europe, and certainly in France, has been one of the most aggressive censors in Europe, along with Germany. France even temporarily banned TikTok in a foreign territory, alleging that there could be risk of riots. So I would just say we don't know the situation with Telegram exactly. The French government is claiming that Telegram did not cooperate with French efforts to prosecute or investigate criminal activity on the site relating to things like terrorism, child pornography, and other forms of plainly illegal speech. And so I support efforts to censor illegal speech like that causes harm. So I think we need to wait a little bit on judging the situation until we know more about it. I would also, there's more to say about the Telegram system, but we don't really know yet. But I think there is reason for alarm. But we should also, I think, take care not to rush to conclusions either.
Let's talk a bit about Telegram itself. Some people may not know too much about it. It's obviously very popular, but not so much in the West. In Russia, in Eastern Europe, it's far more popular. And the founder said he was committed to freedom of speech. He was resisting efforts from the Russian government to censor him. So, what do you make of Telegram itself?
Well, I think it's important to know that Telegram, there's still some things we don't know about it. It's not the default setting. So it's really two things to understand. It's both a messaging app and a social media app. So you can have large group chats with 200,000 people in them. You can share information, including forwarding, mass forwarding. That's a sort of unique feature of it. I think it's worth pointing out that the default setting for all messaging on Telegram is not end-to-end encrypted in the way that it is for both Signal and WhatsApp. Independent cryptographers have audited Signal and WhatsApp and confirmed that it is end-to-end encrypted, meaning that the executives at WhatsApp and Signal cannot read the messages of its users, and the encryption works. And there's been efforts by government to create a backdoor for law enforcement that's been resisted by Signal in particular. In fact, there was a debate between a former member of parliament and the CEO of Signal last year because the member of parliament, Damien Collins, wanted to create a backdoor for law enforcement, and the CEO of Signal resisted that. So that's not the case with Telegram. You have to choose secret chat to have end-to-end encryption. Otherwise, it's only encrypted at the server level. According to Telegram executives, they say that they secure those communications by splitting up the encryption keys across multiple servers, but that has not been audited. And so I, for example, don't use Telegram because it's never struck me as a secure platform. But it is very popular. As you mentioned, it's used by both pro-Russia and anti-Russian individuals. We also saw a report earlier this week that Telegram is widely used by senior French government officials, including the president of France, Emmanuel Macron, even though the French government has warned its own ministers and others not to use Telegram. So I think there's enough. I wasn't one of the first people to just sort of say that this was clearly a crackdown on free speech. I'm suspicious of the French government. I'm concerned about the global crackdown, but I don't think we know yet what this is really about.
Do you think that this would have happened in the United States where they have the First Amendment? Or, is this an issue of, as you say, illegal speech being hosted on the platform, and that perhaps this isn't just about European censorship laws?
We just don't know. I mean, again, if Telegram is truly not cooperating with authorities to crack down on terrorism or child pornography, then yes, then the United States would potentially go after that. It's just worth keeping in mind that Elon Musk, who's made Twitter, now X, a free speech platform, that he has made enforcing laws against child pornography a very high priority. And so that sort of is a separate question. Instagram and Facebook are routinely being criticized for not doing enough, but the company insists that it is. And so I think it just depends on whether this was truly about the issues that the French government said it's about, or whether it's about so-called misinformation.
Why does Telegram matter as a social media app? I know that you talked about pro-Russia, anti-Russian people. Is it important to have social media companies that aren't based all in the United States? Because it seems like Silicon Valley is sort of dominating that space. And perhaps it's beneficial to have companies which aren't just all US based.
Yeah, I mostly agree with that. The only thing, of course, is just that the United States has the strongest free speech protections of anybody in the world. The First Amendment says the government shall take no action to limit speech. The exceptions to that, so we start with the premise that the government should not restrict speech, and then the courts have created some exceptions to it. In other countries, it's a different model. It's more that the government allows certain forms of speech. In the United States, the idea is that free speech comes before the government. So it should actually reassure us that many of these companies are in the United States. But theoretically, I agree it's better to have multiple platforms that you can use in different countries. I think the issue with Telegram is that there is this concern that Telegram could manipulate its own content moderation to favor one side or another in a conflict. It doesn't appear that that's occurred on the Russia conflict, where there's both pro-Russia, anti-Russia, pro-Ukraine, anti-Ukraine information. We have seen articles and concerns raised by NGOs that appear to have pretty strong links to governments and intelligence agencies, raising concerns about Telegram being used for Russian disinformation operations in Africa. I think the concern is that, if you are selectively censoring one side's information, then you are potentially allowing your platform to be used as an instrument of statecraft and of propaganda. And so, again, I'm not saying that we have evidence of this. The concern has been raised that that's what's happening in Africa, including by people that I don't trust. So I'm not endorsing it, but he has there's almost 1 billion users of Telegram. It's a hugely popular app, and so I personally would like to see it. I think a better approach would be for the default setting on all encryption, for it to be end-to-end encryption, and something that sort of provides some guarantee of not censoring one side over another. That's a similar problem, though, with all social media apps. And so the solution, ultimately, I think, is you have multiple social media platforms. So if one platform is censoring in a biased way, then people could get information from another platform.
Isn't there a principle or a point that all social media companies are hosting and complicit in a way of illegal activities like child pornography or drug trade and so on? And obviously they're trying their best, or they say they're trying their best to crack down on these things. And yet Telegram is the only one that's being targeted. So in this way, the founder's been arrested by the French authorities. So do you think that what's going on here, the fact is that, as I said, like other social media companies are probably doing the same thing. We know that there are illegal activities happen on some of these apps all the time. So why aren't they being arrested by the Europeans?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. And remember, when it's end-to-end encrypted, it's going to provide more, ostensibly more, theoretically anyway, more security for criminals than if it's not end-to-end encrypted. So we know, I mean, there's a lot of criminal activity that's occurring, on Signal and WhatsApp. That being said, if there's some evidence, that those companies are not cooperating, or that one company is not cooperating with law enforcement, that could potentially explain it. But no, you're absolutely right. I mean, it was widely pointed out that a lot of different media, including a lot of different communications media, including just the telephone, are used for criminal activities, but we don't hold the CEO of the telephone company responsible for those criminal activities. We do require, though, that they respond to arrest warrants and search warrants, rather. So it's just not clear, what's going on. I mean, it's interesting to consider that maybe the problem here is that Telegram has not used end-to-end encryption and only made it default, because if those communications are on Telegram servers, governments might feel more entitled to getting that information than if the company can legitimately say, well, we can't access it because it's been end-to-end encrypted.
For you, the principle is that if social media companies are not cooperating with the authorities to end these illegal activities, then it's legitimate that they should be held accountable for that. Is that where you draw the line, essentially?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the world I would like to see is a world where you have end-to-end encryption for messaging apps to protect people's privacy. I'd like to see social media be transparent about its recommendation algorithms, in other words, what it's promoting to its users. I would also like to see users have full control adult users have full control over all legal content, I think we're headed to a situation where it's more like there's competition between different platforms in terms of their political bias. But yes, I think that I think most people would agree that if you have evidence of criminal activity, again, you have to have it. You can't have a fishing expedition where you can just have the government have a backdoor and just spy on mass communications. That should be illegal. But yes, if you do have information of criminal activity, then I think the companies, should cooperate with you. Again, though, if you have end-to-end encryption, that won't necessarily matter. So there might be some other information that those companies can share under a search warrant. But if the end-to-end encryption is real, and it appears that it is, then it wouldn't include the communications. Law enforcement wouldn't be able to get it because the companies can't get it.